Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the moon. I first talked about how bizarre the moon was June 2016. That was the first season I was doing the show. This show is going to be a bit confusing, like all of them. I'll be talking about the astronauts landing on the moon, while at the same time, I'll be going over why I no longer believe anyone from the Earth has been to the moon. It's a hard subject to talk about since I used to think it was all true. Once someone has been proven to lie, nothing they say can be believed. I was baking cookies, and I had the confessionals going so I could listen and bake. Tony Merkel had Bart Sibrel on talking about some interesting things. Things some folks don't want to contemplate, let alone talk about. Things like the moon landing in 1969 being faked. Most subjects can be discussed amongst rational people with little chance of getting injured. Tell some people the moon landings were faked and you might wind up in the hospital. People are dead set in their ideas and they don't want to even consider the possibility that watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking around on that fuzzy black and white TV show wasn't really what was going on. You'd think they could have used a better camera. Well, actually they did. There was a camera mounted on the leg of the lunar lander with high-quality abilities. You could see the faces of Armstrong and Aldrin as they set foot on our closest neighbor. The images being broadcast to TV sets all over the world were lousy because there was no way to broadcast images coming from outer space at the time. To put the video out to the world, NASA had a TV camera placed in front of a monitor showing what was going on 238,855 miles away. By doing this, we were all treated to a less than spectacular movie. Still, the world went wild. Humans had made it to the moon, and now they just had to get back home. Or at least, that's what we all thought. Until maybe a few years ago, I was convinced we, that is humans, had walked on the moon. I was convinced it was true. I'd seen it on TV. Walter Cronkite said it was true. All the half-truths and downright lies coming from Washington and the lamestream media has gotten me to wondering what really happened with any event shown to us. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, for one. I can't even rely on my own memory. My brother and I used to talk about watching JFK get shot on TV back in 1963. We were sitting on the floor of the living room watching an old black and white TV. It was showing Kennedy riding around in Dallas. Our mother was standing in the doorway when shots rang out and things got weird. Our mother started crying, and we both thought it might have been something we did. Well, turns out she really liked Kennedy, as she even liked to dress kind of like Jackie Kennedy with those weird white gloves and things. As she finally told us that someone had killed the president. When we realized we were not in trouble, we both breathed a sigh of relief. We watched it on TV in 1963. The trouble is, there was no TV coverage of Kennedy in Dallas at the time. The first broadcast of the Zapruder film was on late-night television show Underground News with Chuck Collins, which originated out of Chicago in 1970. By this time, I was 12 and my brother was 14. We both knew we had seen the film in 1963. This is known as the Mandela Effect. The term Mandela Effect was first coined in 2009 by Fiona Broome when she created a website to detail her observations of this weird phenomenon. Broome was at a conference talking with other people about how she remembered the tragedy of former South African President Nelson Mandela's death in a South African prison in 1980. Nelson Mandela did not die in the 80s in prison. He died in 2013. As Broome began to talk to other people about her memories, she learned that she was not alone. Others remembered seeing news coverage of his death as well as a speech that was given by his widow. I remember hearing about his death as well. I was convinced the South African authorities were lying when they announced that Mandela was being released from prison. I thought it's some kind of an imposter, and they're just trying to pretend like he hadn't died. Broome was shocked that such a large mass of people could remember the same identical event in such detail when it never happened. Encouraged by her book publisher, she began her website to discuss what she called the Mandela Effect and other incidents very much like it. It turned out I'm not the only person who watched Kennedy get shot in Dallas in 1963. Thousands of people remember seeing a TV broadcast that never happened. Makes me wonder how much else of our history is wrong. What might be going on around us that is not what we're being told is true? Our moon doesn't have a name. Why not? Mars has 2 moons, and they both have names, Phobos and Deimos, the sons of the god Mars. Saturn has 82 moons. 53 are confirmed, and they've been named. Once the other 29 moons are confirmed as being moons and not something else, like maybe a spaceship, scientists will give them names as well. However, our moon is just called the moon. Luna means moon. Here we are with one of the biggest moons compared to the size of our planet, and it has no name. Folks say the moon orbits the Earth, but actually we kind of orbit each other. What you might say, both orbit each other, about a barycenter. The moon orbits the Earth, and the Earth orbits the moon. The mass of the moon slightly affects the motion of the Earth, so that both Earth and moon orbit around a point in between them called the center of mass of the Earth-Moon system, or barycenter. The barycenter happens to be about 1,000 miles beneath the Earth's crust. As the moon goes overhead, it causes the Earth to move back and forth, like we're orbiting the moon. I'd have to put a diagram up and make a bunch of lines and arrows showing what this means. Just ignore this if it hurts your brain too much. The moon is rotating at the same rate that it revolves around the Earth. This is called a synchronous rotation, so that the same hemisphere faces Earth at all time. The side of the moon that always faces away from us is called the dark side of the moon. There is no dark side of the moon. As a matter of fact, it's all dark. That's a Pink Floyd reference for those of you that got it. What do scientists tell us about the moon? It's 238,855 miles from the Earth. If you wanted to drive there, you could. Driving at 75 miles an hour, it would take you 4.5 months to reach the moon. That's driving 24/7 with no bathroom breaks or rest stops. You'd need a lot of coffee and some sandwiches and maybe a bucket. It takes 27.32 days to complete one orbital phase. The moon will appear in the sky 43 minutes later each night. If the moon comes up at 10 p.m. on Monday, it will rise at 10:43 Tuesday night. The moon is the exact right size that when it moves between the Earth and the sun, it blocks out the sun. And when the Earth comes between the sun and the moon, the Earth blocks out the reflection of the moon completely. This gives us lunar and solar eclipses. Now for what makes the moon strange. It's going to get complicated from here. The moon is at least 4.6 billion years old, and some of the rocks were announced to be 5.3 billion years old. Not only is the moon a lot older than Earth, as measured by their best current data, there is a huge difference in age on the moon itself, which defies explanation. The dust is a lot older than the rocks. Where did the dust on the moon come from? Not from the rocks. If the dust was just ground up rocks, it would be the same age as the rest of the planet, or moon. There are ancient writings and legends about when there was no moon in the sky. The period when the Earth was moonless is probably the most remote recollection of mankind. Democritus and Anaxagoras thought that there was a time when the Earth was without a moon. Aristotle wrote that Arcadia in Greece, before being inhabited by the Hellenists, had a population of Pelasgians, and that these aborigines occupied the land before there was a moon in the sky. The reason they're called Proselenius. Apollonius of Rhodes mentioned of the time when not all the orbits were yet in the heavens, before the Danae and Deucalion races came into existence, and only the Arcadians lived, of whom it is said they dwelt on the mountains before there was a moon. Plutarch wrote in the Roman Question, there were Arcadians of Avenders following the so-called pre-lunar people. Ovid wrote, the Arcadians are said to have possessed their land before the birth of Jove, and the folk is older than the moon. Hippolytus refers to a legend that Arcadia brought forth Pelasgus of the great antiquity than the moon. Lucian in his astrology said the Arcadians affirm in their folly that they are older than the moon. Says Censornus also alludes to a time in the past when there was no moon in the sky. Seeing as the moon is older than the Earth, it must have come here from someplace else. Being such a huge satellite, if it was drawn to our planet in some haphazard way, it would have destroyed the Earth instead of becoming trapped in our orbit. If, on the other hand, it was guided here for unknown reasons, it could have arrived with little or no effect on life here on the planet. If you look up at the moon, you'll see some dark spots. These are called Mars, which means seas. If the moon had huge oceans on its surface, this is what you would see. These Mars have great gravitational anomalies in them. It took NASA a long time to figure this out, and quite some swearing was overheard at Orbit Command while trying to send satellites around the moon. These things are 10 times as strong as gravitational anomalies here on Earth. When any kind of a space probe was sent to the moon, it would be affected by the gravitational pull from the Mars, causing all kinds of guidance problems. 80% of these gravitational anomalies are on the side of the moon facing us. This could be why the moon rotates as it orbits, causing it to always see the same surface. It's as if the moon is tethered to the Earth by an invisible cable, as if this was done on purpose. Since ancient times, full moons have been associated with odd or insane behavior, including sleepwalking, suicide, illegal activity, fits of violence, and of course, transforming into werewolves. As skeptics and scientists will tell you no such thing happens. Then again, you never see skeptics or scientists working in the ER on a full moon. Being a paramedic, I saw a lot of bizarre activity from folks who might have been feeling the draw of our moon. The British Police Department have decided to add extra officers on nights with a full moon. In 18th century England, people on trial for murder could campaign for a lighter sentence on grounds of lunacy if the crime occurred under a full moon. The term lunatic comes from the moon causing people to go nuts. A lunatic is an old term that was used to refer to a person with a mental illness or a mental disability. The term goes back to the Latin word lunaticus, which means of the moon or moonstruck. It was also used in English law until about 1930, when it was replaced by person of unsound mind. In the 1820s, the Bavarian astronomer Franz von Paula Guthrusen claimed to have seen cities on the moon through his telescope. He said the Lunarians who lived there had built sophisticated buildings, roads, and forts. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson was inspired by a strange yet very true case of Charles Hyde, a London man who committed a series of crimes at the time of the full moon. In some Chinese religions, offerings are made to ancestors on the night of the full moon. The full moon is believed to be a good time for divination and scrying. Nostradamus is one of the most famous scryers in history. You can use just about any shiny surface. He used a bowl of water. You sit in a mostly dark room. You place the bowl of water or a mirror in the center of a good solid table. If it's a mirror, it has to be facing up towards the ceiling. You look across the surface and see what comes into your mind. You try to see what you can't normally see. I use a small handheld mirror on ghost hunts to look for spirits. You hold it in an angle so you can see what might be standing next to you. For many pagans, now pagans are those who believe in more than one god, the cycles of the moon are important to magical workings. It's believed in some traditions that the waxing, the full, the waning, and a new moon all have their own special magical properties, and so workings should be planned accordingly. In 1957, when the Soviet Union sent a small satellite called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth, Russian and American scientists had been competing to see who could make the next breakthrough in space travel. In 1961, shortly after being elected, President John F. Kennedy announced that he was determined to win the space race with the Soviets. Kennedy upped the ante when he announced the United States would put a man on the moon and bring him back to the Earth before the end of the decade. August 1963, Kennedy gave a speech at the United Nations where he proposed that the Soviet Union and the United States cooperate in mounting a mission to the moon. The cost of all those rockets and spacesuits was piling up. If the U.S. and the USSR shared the cost, it would be beneficial to both as well as all of mankind. Kennedy told NASA to prepare to share all their secrets with the Soviets. Instead of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin going to the moon, it might have been Neil Armstrong and Yuri Gagarin. Just how would they decide who went down the ladder first? Maybe arm wrestling? Rock, paper, scissors? One of them might pull a gun and shoot the other one? We won't know because it never happened in our dimension. Just a thought. The United States and the Soviet space program were both being run by ex-Nazis. All their scientists, as well as ours, were from Germany. They had a tendency to write back and forth. Scientific letters going and coming from both supposed secret organizations. The U.S. Nazi scientists were asking questions of the Soviet Nazi scientists. They would also tell those on the other side of the planet what they were doing and how it worked out. Under Operation Paperclip, thousands of Nazi war criminals were brought to the United States and allowed to conduct scientific experiments paid for with our tax dollars. Just who authorized this? Allen Dulles was in charge of the OSS, which later became the CIA. He was also the guy who ran the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy fired him for lying. When Kennedy was killed, who was put in charge of finding the shooter? None other than Allen Dulles. Am I the only one who thinks this was just a little bit wrong? You know that guy who fired you? We want you to find out who killed him. Do you think if somebody in the CIA had actually pulled the trigger, Dulles would have told on him? Or do you think he might have just placed the blame on some patsy's lap? A lot of folks want us to believe guys like Wernher von Braun were not real Nazis. They only joined because they wanted to keep their jobs. On page 277 of Dark Mission by Richard C. Hoagland, you can find a photograph of the bar where our rocket scientists would hang out. There was a swastika on the sign hanging over the front door. Just 2 months after announcing the planned cooperation, John Kennedy lost his mind in Dallas. 1969, astronauts were flying around the moon in Apollo 10 mission, which was not going to land. They were just going to circle the moon and then come back. While on the far side of the moon, They heard what was described as outer space type music. A high-pitched whistling sound was so weird that astronaut Gene Cernan said, "No one is going to believe us." The sound was probably especially weird because the astronauts were flying around the far side of the moon where radio transmission between them and the controllers on Earth was cut off. The official answer was they were hearing the sounds of stars. Electromagnetic humming, whistling, and buzzing coming over their radio. If this were the case, then why could they only hear it while passing over the dark side of the moon? If it were star sounds, the sound should have been heard the entire trip. I would think there was some kind of maybe communication going from the moon to some unknown place. Maybe that's what they were hearing. The TV images coming from the moon were as low quality as you could get. Filming a TV monitor will do that. Once the crew were back on Earth, you'd think the real film footage would be released. Nope, NASA decided we didn't need to see it. They dressed up the images broadcast over the TV, and they said that was good enough. Makes me wonder what might have been caught on camera that the boys in the white lab coats didn't want us to see. On the Apollo 11 mission, they had two 16mm Mauer motion picture film cameras. They had color film from the command module and black and white on the moon lander. This should have been like watching a movie from Hollywood instead of some kindergarten production. One theory bouncing around is that the footage was intentionally made bad so nobody would notice it was filmed on a sound stage. NASA had some huge sound stages built before the Apollo mission took off. Why would NASA have sound stages built to make film if they didn't intend on using them? What purpose can you think of? Practicing on how Neil Armstrong would film Buzz Aldrin raising the flag? It's pretty well known that the giant sound sets were constructed to simulate the moon's surface, and that models of the lunar module were filmed with actors wearing spacesuits. NASA denies that these simulations were ever substituted for the actual manned lunar modules. After raising the American flag, gathering some moon samples, taking some pictures, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin returned to the lunar module, only to realize the switch that caused the craft to leave the moon was broke. This particular broken switch left them without a way to ignite the engines, so they were told to sleep on it, while the folks back at home at NASA were going to try and figure out a way to fix it. Eventually, Aldrin decided that enough was enough, and he jammed his pen into the mechanism, creating a makeshift switch. Surprisingly, this quick fix worked, and it launched both Aldrin and Armstrong off the lunar surface. Maybe. Anytime you think astronauts are just some folks in space, remember they have to come up with solutions to problems that we can't even conceive of here on Earth. After Aldrin hit the button to begin the launch, he looked out the window and he watched as the American flag was blasted away with the rest of the material left behind on the lunar surface. Aldrin and Armstrong decided to not tell anyone about blowing the first flag off the face of the moon. A lot of people picture the flag still standing on the moon with its red, white, and blue colors. All the radiation coming down on the surface with no atmosphere to slow it down would bleach out all the colors in a short time. Had the flag not been blown over, it would have looked like a white flag, as if somebody was trying to surrender. As the Apollo 11 team arrived safely on Earth, the crew were brought to Hawaii. Despite being the three most famous men at the time, as they had just landed on the moon safely and returned, they were still asked to fill out customs declarations by security. In the section asking departure from, the Apollo 11 crew wrote, "The moon. No matter what you do, you can't escape bureaucracy." Years later, retired astronaut Buzz Aldrin revealed, "Everything we saw and heard was carefully scripted and rehearsed." The astronauts even used cue cards to describe their impressions of the distant Earth and the surface of the moon. Apparently, NASA was frightened that something might accidentally be revealed to the millions of viewers. Some desk jockey, a ballpoint pen warrior, had written out all their conversations. As Neil and Buzz stood on the moon looking back at the Earth and told how wonderful it looked, it was all scripted. Just like watching a movie from Hollywood. Like they were actors playing parts as being astronauts. In front of them was some guy in a Hawaiian shirt who yelled, "Cut," after they did their parts. Any conversations heard over the radio were written out ahead of time. All the talk we listened to during the Apollo missions was like listening to any conversation on a movie. It was all fiction. There were tape recordings of things going on in the spaceships we weren't allowed to hear. Things like the conversation between Armstrong and Aldrin as they came close to landing on the moon. They saw what looked like vegetation growing in the Mars as they passed over them. Once on the moon, the two men said they could see alien spaceships along the edges of the craters. They said they were not alone up there. Once back on Earth, the astronauts were isolated and hypnotized. It is said this was to help them remember what they had seen. If I set foot on a moon or a planet, I wouldn't need any help remembering it. This sounds too much like what happens to people abducted by aliens. Most of them have a hard time remembering what all happened while in the custody of beings from other planets. This could be something passed on by the aliens back when they signed that treaty with Eisenhower to allow tests be conducted on citizens without their consent. I used to believe we went to the moon. However, NASA has a nasty habit of touching up photos to erase anything they deem as too weird for us commoners. Long before Photoshop, there was the black felt-tipped pen. Lots of photos have been changed. Lots of scientific calculations written out using slide rule calculators was burned. Just remember what Richard C. Hoagland says. NASA stands for never a straight answer. Over 50 years ago, men climbed into a rocket, flew over 200,000 miles, and landed on the moon. Today, NASA says they can't do this. They don't have the calculations to get her done. They destroyed everything, and not just all the paperwork, but all the machines used to make the calculations. They took them apart. There's a small glitch in NASA's own Apollo data. The astronauts' spacesuits had radiation meters sewn into them. The readings on these radiation meters show that for the complete Apollo moon landing mission, the astronauts were only exposed to something like 0.8 rem of radiation. Even if they had just gone to the International Space Station, which is way below the Van Allen belt, they would have experienced more radiation than this. NASA's own Apollo data looks as if the Apollo spacecraft never left Earth's orbit. I'm willing to bet the folks at NASA have changed this data to make it look as if the men in that tin can did actually receive radiation now that they know people are looking. November 20th, 1969, the Apollo 12 landing craft was jettisoned from the command module and it crashed to the surface of the moon so they could record seismic data. As the landing craft smashed into the moon, the sounds recorded were more like a bell than a rock. This ringing went on for an hour. Nobody was expecting this. They hadn't written out a script for anybody to read from, so the astronauts just stayed quiet. And NASA claimed that this ringing was due to the sound waves passing through the moon's core, like the sound you get when you thump a bowling ball. You know, that ringing sound. Well, it's more like a dull thud. If the moon were not hollow, why would it ring? If the moon is hollow, what might we find deep under the surface? If you look at the evidence, the moon is far older than the Earth. People talk about a time when there was no moon. The moon is hollow. Parts of the moon didn't begin on the moon. Maybe there's some ancient race of star voyagers who came to our solar system thousands of years ago for unknown reasons. If you follow Zecharia Sitchin, you'll know about the Anunnaki who came from Nibiru thousands of years ago to mine for gold. When the work became too much for the aliens, they created humans to dig for gold. This might explain why people get so weird when gold enters the picture. Maybe the moon was their spaceship, and once they were finished, they simply left it like the lunar landing craft that are littering the moon's surface. Apollo 11 cost the U.S. taxpayers $185 million. Well, this was in 1969. That's about $1,295 million today. The film taken while supposedly on the moon, since I've begun to think we might not have actually been there, cost a ton of money. The movie Titanic cost about $200 million to make. The folks who made it made $2.2 billion return on their investment. The footage from the moon was all expense and no return. The folks at NASA could have sold copies of the moon film if they had thought it through. If there wasn't something caught on film they didn't want the folks on Earth to see. Or maybe the film showed the soundstage in the background. Some desk jockey at NASA decided the film took up too much space on a shelf somewhere. The $185 million movie was erased and recorded over to save a few dollars and some storage space. The most expensive movie ever made was erased. At least, that's what NASA tells us. How much easier would it be to believe some executive simply took the film home and now has a rather expensive keepsake? There are those working for the government, in other words, working for us, who believe they have the right to take things we paid for. Under normal conditions, this would be called stealing. When people work for the government, they begin to think they're above all those bothersome laws that the rest of us have to obey. Either NASA actually landed on the moon, or there was evidence of aliens already there, or they faked the whole thing. NASA released thousands of images from the moon, many taken by unmanned craft. People with the time and the equipment have analyzed some of these images and found all kinds of unexplainable anomalies. There are what look like structures on the moon. Once revealed to the public, NASA quickly pulled the images from their website, touched them up, and then resubmitted them. See, there's nothing to see here. Richard C. Hoagland was on Coast to Coast AM many times in the past. He would explain what they had found in the images from NASA and put photos on their website so you could look for yourself. I spent a lot of time at enterprisemission.com looking at the images from both the Moon and Mars. If you have the time, you can check out the site and spend the next couple of months looking at all the images found on the NASA website that are no longer available to the public. The Apollo program was paid for in tax dollars before the moon landing even took off. I'm going to call it that, even though it might not have happened. Apollo 1 burned up on the launch pad in Florida. 3 astronauts were killed in what sounds like an unnecessary test run. It was planned to launch February 21st, 1967, as the first low Earth orbit test of the Apollo Command and Service Module. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were the crew chosen for the first Apollo mission. The several fires in high oxygen test environments had occurred before the Apollo fire. When concerns of a possible onboard fire were brought up by the crew, orders went to the people responsible for building the Apollo Command Module to remove any and all flammable materials. Apparently, these orders were ignored. The astronauts had gone over every possible scenario for months leading up to January 27th. They had endured exhaustive training. The Apollo 1 crew expressed their concerns about their spacecraft's problems. They released a photograph of all 3 men praying over a model of their craft. Gus Grissom had a reputation for saying what he thought. Virgil Yvonne Grissom was the most popular of the astronauts and the most outspoken critic of the space program. If something wasn't right and the higher-ups ignored it, Gus was the guy who would tell the public. In July 21st, 1961, Grissom was the pilot of the second Project Mercury flight, the Liberty Bell 7, which was launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, for a suborbital flight that lasted 15 minutes and 37 seconds. After splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean, the Liberty Bell 7 emergency explosive bolts went off unexpectedly, blowing off the hatch and causing water to flood into the spacecraft. Grissom barely escaped with his life. This led to his lack of trust for the folks building their spacecraft, as well as the guys in charge. NASA did an unofficial smear campaign, basically blaming him for losing the Liberty Bell 7. They said he hit the emergency door button. July 9th, 2019, the Liberty Bell 7 was recovered from the bottom of the Atlantic. They discovered the explosive bolt's actuator was still intact. The reason the door popped open was the spacecraft had warped on impact with the water. Gus was finally proven correct. He didn't blow the door like they said he did. He was as surprised as anyone when the door popped open. When the Apollo spacecraft lost communications while sitting on the launch pad, Grissom said, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" He called the module a bucket full of screws. He picked a lemon from his backyard, tied it to the side of the spacecraft, and took photographs of it. These pictures showed up all over the planet. The Apollo spacecraft was a lemon. January 27th, the crew members of the Apollo 1 were using the time to run through their checklists again when a momentary increase in AC bus number 2 voltage occurred. 9 seconds later, Grissom said over the radio, "Fire!" The pure oxygen atmosphere quickly filled the command module with flames. All that flammable material that was supposed to have been removed was now on fire. The fire began to consume everything inside. The door to the spacecraft had to be unbolted from the outside. It took over 6 minutes to open the craft. By this time, all 3 astronauts were dead. NASA immediately went into the blame game. Who could they make into the scapegoat, and quick? The finger was pointed to North American aviation, the folks who put the Apollo 1 together. Thomas Ronald Barron, a quality control and safety inspector for North American aviation, the guys that built Apollo 1 command module, wrote a 55-page report detailing the shortcomings of the entire space program. He testified to Congress that under then current circumstances, NASA, the U.S., would never make it to the moon. After Grissom's death, Barron worked to expand his report to 500 pages. Before his research could be released to the public, Barron and his entire family were killed in a car accident. Was it really an accident? We may never know. As soon as the family was dead, the government moved in, confiscated all of the paperwork pertaining to the Apollo 1 disaster from Barron's office. We don't get to see it. The term conspiracy theory was coined by the CIA after people began to question JFK's death. They wanted to make anyone questioning the official story as being un-American or crazy or both. I say instead of calling it a conspiracy theory, they should call it a spoiler alert. All the other Apollo astronauts now had a choice to make: keep their mouths shut and keep their jobs, or follow in Gus's footsteps. Keep in mind, the guys actually running NASA were all the Nazis brought to the United States after World War II. Nazis had a way of doing things. If someone got in their way, they were simply removed. There are folks out there who will sell their souls for riches and glory. When I say the government, I'm not talking about the folks we elect every so often who then go to Washington to become millionaires, ignoring all of their campaign promises. I'm talking about the folks we never see or hear from, the shadow government that actually runs things. Did the U.S. really beat the Soviets to the moon? More correctly, did the U.S. Nazi scientists beat the Soviet Nazi scientists to the moon? The men who were supposed to step out of the spacecraft were both Americans, but they didn't get there on their own. It took thousands of people working on all kinds of things like the spaceship, the calculations to get from here to there, the people making spacesuits, food, water, and bathroom facilities. Kind of like a giant diaper. A lot of people had to sit in cubicles all over the country to come up with solutions to problems that nobody had ever thought of before. These were not desk jockeys getting glory from others' work. These were the people who worked hard day and night to come up with all the little niggly problems the astronauts might run into. They did use computers, but only sparingly. As for calculators, all the electronic work had to be checked and approved by humans. Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson did all the math using paper and pencils, checking to be sure that the computers got it right. A slide rule calculator is a chunk of wood with numbers on the face. The middle of this device slides back and forth, giving you answers to math problems. I had one once. I had no idea how to use it or where I got it. The folks working at NASA used slide rule calculators for most of the work. NASA has admitted that it isn't possible to visit the moon after claiming they no longer have the technology because it was all destroyed years ago. According to astronaut Don Petit, the space agency doesn't have the resources necessary to rebuild technology it would require to send explorers back to the moon. They want to go to Mars, but they can't get to the moon. At the Space for Innovation conference in London's Science Museum, Petit said he hoped that the U.S. would be able to collaborate with other countries to make a moon landing possible. The same way we did back in 1969, I guess. If, and this is the big question, if the United States already landed on the moon using pencils and paper and slide rule calculators, can't they figure it out using all those super powerful computers the NSA is using to spy on us with? The only way this makes sense is if the Apollo space program only went into orbit around the Earth and the footage was all made on a sound stage. Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 were supposed to have carried 2 men each to the moon. That's 12 men who may have spent their time waltzing around in the front of a film crew instead of boldly going where no man has gone before. After the final manned moon landing of Apollo 17 on December 11, 1972, NASA terminated the entire lunar expedition, despite the fact that the next Saturn V rocket, the lunar module, and the astronauts were already paid for and waiting to be sent. Does it seem as if something or someone told us to stay away from the moon? All the rockets and spacecraft had been built for the next 20 trips to the moon. Today they are rusting away as some of the most expensive junkyard pieces ever constructed. Since when has our government considered saving money? Oh yes, the winning bids were always the lowest bidder, but then came the cost overruns and the budget mismanagement that always plagues each and every government endeavor. How much was one of those hammers again? That nonsense about the government can't keep secrets is probably being spread around by the same folks that are keeping all those secrets. If some unknown operative were to approach one of the people involved and say, "Remember what happened to Gus Grissom and Thomas Barron? Keep your mouth shut." How many people would ignore such sage advice? How many people go missing each year? How many people die from odd accidents? Can secrets be kept? If those in charge have no scruples, I believe all kinds of secrets can be kept. This combined with how a lot of people refuse to even consider the possibility of our government doing nasty, unethical things, people don't want to know what takes place. How many people that eat meat have any idea what happens in a slaughterhouse? How many people driving electric cars know how those batteries are actually made and what happens to them once the car is no longer serviceable? Ignorance is bliss. Scientific equipment placed on the moon using unmanned craft have registered earthquakes. They're not really earthquakes since they're on the moon. Moonquakes. But the boys in the white lab coats did call them earthquakes. Earthquakes are caused by the tectonic plates moving around under our feet. There are no tectonic plates on the moon. The quakes being registered on the equipment can't be explained, so the scientists just say, earthquakes, perfectly normal, nothing to see here, move along. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Most people think the moon is, well, a moon, but there are those who say it should actually be classified as a planet. For one, it's far too big to be a true moon. It's 1.5 times as big as Pluto. In my book, Pluto is still a planet. The moon is not the biggest satellite orbiting a planet. The largest moon in our solar system is Ganymede, the 7th moon orbiting Jupiter. It has a radius of 1,636 miles. Our moon's radius is 1,079 miles. Ganymede is so big it has its own magnetic field. Our moon is number 5 in size, but all the other colossal moons orbit around huge planets. 3 huge moons orbit around Jupiter and 1 around Saturn. If the moon were not orbiting the Earth, it would be called a planet. When the moon is 95% visible, it's only half as bright as when it's 100% visible. How can 5% more visibility account for 50% more illumination? The moon encompasses a huge temperature range. The temperature at the lunar equator ranges from an extremely low of 280 degrees Fahrenheit, that's minus 280 degrees Fahrenheit at night, to 260 degrees Fahrenheit in the daytime. In some of the deep craters near the moon's poles, the temperature is always around 400 degrees, minus 400 degrees Fahrenheit. One thing that surprises astronauts who visit the moon was the strong odor of the lunar dust, which they were only able to smell when they got back inside the lunar module. Do I need to say it? If they actually got there? Neil Armstrong described the dust scent as similar to wet ashes in a fireplace. Other astronauts said it smelled like burnt gunpowder. We only have NASA's word for this. So what happened on the moon that caused us to give up on moon landings? Was it perpetuating a hoax was just too much for the boys in the white lab coats? Did beings tell them to stay away? What caused NASA to decide to focus on near-Earth missions and abandon space exploration altogether? Once in a while, NASA sends up a probe that takes some spectacular images of our flags on the moon. A CGI comes to mind when I see them. If the flag isn't bleached white, it's CGI. Or maybe a probe landed on the moon, stuck a flag in the ground, took off and flew away. Are there aliens on the moon? Ingo Swann, a remote viewer, said he spotted a complex in one of the craters while visualizing the surface. Swann was able to perceive on the surface of the moon a wealth of domed structures, advanced machinery, additional tall towers, large cross-like structures, tubular constructions crossing the landscape, and even evidence of what looked like mining operations. Just about everything coming from NASA has to be considered a lie until proven otherwise. Never a straight answer. They doctor photographs, use secret communication channels. They let us pay for their mistakes, and then they ask for millions more each year. Their track record is so shaky, I'm surprised they haven't collapsed under the weight of their mistakes yet. As for our satellite, the moon, is it just a huge rock orbiting our planet, or could it be a spaceship that we all have gotten so used to we never question it? Oumuamua didn't look like a spaceship, yet it did make maneuvers as it crossed our solar system. The moon might have been just a moon from some far distant system that was converted into a hollow or honeycombed sphere to carry beings from one star system to ours for alien purposes. The idea of aliens flying back and forth to Zeta Reticuli or the Pleiades each night was a Hollywood construct made for Washington to make people less inclined to believe in aliens or flying saucers. They can't get here from there, they keep saying. Betelgeuse is estimated to be 643 light years from Earth. That means it would take somewhere between 500 and 800 years to fly from there to here if they were traveling at around the speed of light. They could have started in our direction thousands of years ago and simply stayed. If aliens started in our direction 2,000 years ago, they could have stopped off at Pluto for a bathroom break. As for the moon, it could have started out life on the edge of our solar system. Maybe it was a planet out past Pluto. Along comes some folks in flying saucers with highly advanced knowledge who dug tunnels and cavities into it before somehow moving it into our orbit. If you want to hear more on the subject of our moon landing being just a bunch of fakes, check out the Confessionals Moon Man episode. Bart Sibrel has some interesting information. If the name Sibrel sounds familiar, he is the reporter that got punched in the nose by Buzz Aldrin after asking if the moon landings had been faked. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, spread it around. Let other people know what you're listening to. Tell them how great it is, or at least tell them it's worth listening to. If you have something you'd like to tell me, either a show you'd like to hear or something you'd like to add to my next book, you can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. If you'd like to listen to all of the archives shows, the ones you can't find on Podomatic or iTunes or all the other places, you can find all the past shows on iHeartRadio or on YouTube. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?